For years, the world believed it had seen the full story. A wealthy man exposed, a criminal network uncovered, an arrest that seemed to promise justice. And then suddenly, silence. Jeffrey Epstein's case did not end with answers. It ended with unanswered questions. The official narrative closed the file, but the evidence suggested something far larger remained buried beneath sealed documents, redacted names, and forgotten testimonies. What if the Epstein case was never meant to reveal everything? What if it was only meant to reveal enough? For decades, powerful systems have learned how to survive exposure. They do not rely on secrecy alone. They rely on complexity, distraction, and time. When enough years pass, public attention fades, witnesses move on, and accountability quietly disappears. This is where Epstein-like files enter the story. Not a single document, not one dramatic leak, but a growing collection of records, lawsuits, depositions, financial trails, and investigative notes that were hidden, delayed, or ignored for years. Files that suggest Epstein was not an isolated anomaly, but part of a recurring pattern that protects wealth and power at the expense of truth. When Epstein was first investigated in the early 2000s, the warning signs were already clear. Complaints had been filed. Testimonies were recorded. Law enforcement agencies had evidence pointing to systemic abuse. Yet consequences were minimal. Deals were made. Charges were reduced. Silence was purchased. That outcome did not happen by accident. In cases involving ordinary criminals, investigations move forward quickly. Evidence is gathered. Charges are filed. Trials begin. But when extreme wealth and influence enter the equation, the rules quietly change. Investigations slow. Jurisdiction becomes complicated. Prosecutors hesitate. Civil settlements replace criminal accountability. Epstein's case followed that exact script, but what makes the situation more disturbing is what happened after his death. Instead of opening doors, it closed them. Instead of expanding investigations, it narrowed them. Instead of revealing networks, it reduced the story to a single villain. That simplification served a purpose, because systems do not fear exposure of individuals. They fear exposure of structures. The Epstein-like files that are now emerging do not focus on one man. They focus on how protection works, how influence shapes outcomes, how certain names remain consistently absent from public records, even when evidence suggests they should be present. These files come from many sources: civil court filings unsealed years later, journalistic investigations that were delayed due to legal threats, financial documents that raised concerns but were never fully examined, flight logs that show patterns without explanations, testimonies that were archived but never amplified. Individually, each piece can be dismissed. Together, they reveal something harder to ignore. One of the most important elements of these files is what they do not explicitly say. Instead of making direct accusations, they show proximity, association, opportunity, repeated presence in environments where abuse occurred, and in powerful circles, proximity is never accidental. When investigators analyze elite misconduct cases, they often encounter the same obstacles. Witnesses are reluctant to speak. Victims fear retaliation. Media outlets face legal pressure. Lawyers issue warnings. Editors hesitate. Stories die before they reach the public. This is not censorship in the traditional sense. It is deterrence. Over time, deterrence becomes normalization. Journalists learn which stories are too risky. Prosecutors learn which cases are too complex. Institutions learn which donors are untouchable. Epstein did not invent this system. He benefited from it. And the files coming to light suggest he was not alone. One of the most revealing aspects of post-Epstein investigations is how often records were sealed. Courts routinely protect privacy, but in cases involving elite misconduct, sealing becomes a shield. It prevents scrutiny. It delays public understanding. It fragments the narrative. By the time documents are unsealed, the urgency is gone. The public has moved on. The news cycle has shifted. The outrage has expired. This is why timing matters. Many Epstein-like files were not hidden forever. They were hidden long enough for statutes of limitations to expire, long enough for witnesses to lose credibility in the public eye, long enough for institutions to claim ignorance. This strategy is not illegal. It is procedural, and procedure can be more effective than denial. When people imagine conspiracies, they often imagine secret meetings and coded messages. The reality is far less dramatic and far more effective. The real mechanism is bureaucracy, paperwork, delays, legal language, jurisdictional confusion. By the time the truth becomes visible, it no longer feels urgent. But now, years later, fragments of these files are resurfacing, not because the system suddenly changed, but because persistence outlasted pressure. Journalists kept digging, lawyers kept filing motions, survivors kept speaking, even when they were ignored, and slowly, records began to emerge. Not enough to deliver a single explosive revelation, enough to reveal a pattern, The pattern shows how certain individuals repeatedly appear on the edges of scandal, but never at the center, how names are referenced indirectly, how associations are acknowledged without explanation, how accountability stops just short of consequence. This is where the phrase Epstein-like becomes important. It does not claim identical crimes. It does not assign guilt. It describes a structure where money buys distance, where influence buys time, where silence is more valuable than truth. The Epstein case became famous because it briefly broke through that structure, but the file suggests the structure remained intact, and structures that remain intact continue operating. The most uncomfortable question raised by these documents is not who committed crimes, but who ensured those crimes never fully surfaced, who intervened, who negotiated, who redirected attention. Because abuse does not survive alone, it survives with assistance. As more documents come into public view, the story becomes harder to dismiss. It no longer relies on rumors. It relies on records, on dates, on transactions, on sworn statements. And while many names remain hidden, the absence itself is telling. When accountability is selective, it reveals its own bias. What we are witnessing now is not a sudden exposure. It is the slow erosion of a protective barrier that took decades to build. Every unsealed document removes one brick. Every testimony weakens the wall. And the wall was never meant to last forever. The question is not whether more will come out. The question is, how much will be allowed to come out? Because even now, the process is controlled. Information is released cautiously. Narratives are framed carefully. Legal boundaries remain intact. But the direction is clear. The Epstein story did not end. It was paused. As more documents surface, a disturbing consistency begins to emerge. The same procedural delays, the same reluctance from institutions, the same careful language that avoids direct conclusions while quietly revealing uncomfortable realities. This consistency is not coincidence. It is the signature of a system that knows how to protect itself. One of the most overlooked aspects of Epstein-like cases is how early warning signs are neutralized. Complaints are not always dismissed outright. Instead, they are reclassified, reduced, handled administratively. When a report does not lead to immediate consequences, it loses urgency. When urgency disappears, accountability follows. In several documented cases connected to Epstein-style networks, concerns were flagged internally years before the public ever heard a word. Emails exist, memos exist, interviews were conducted, and yet no decisive action followed. The reason was never a lack of information, it was a lack of will. Will becomes fragile when power is involved. The files now emerging show that influence rarely operates directly. There are no recorded orders demanding silence, no explicit instructions to shut down investigations. What exists instead is suggestion, pressure, professional risk, the unspoken understanding that pursuing certain leads could end careers. In law enforcement, prosecutors must weigh cases they can win. When defendants have unlimited resources, teams of elite lawyers, and access to political influence, even strong cases become uncertain. That uncertainty breeds hesitation. Hesitation becomes delay. Delay becomes decay. Evidence does not disappear immediately. It erodes. Witnesses forget details. Memories fade. Physical records are misplaced. Digital data is archived. Over time, what once seemed undeniable becomes debatable. This is how accountability is lost without ever being denied. Another critical element revealed by Epstein-like files is the role of private settlements. Civil cases often end quietly. Financial compensation is offered. Non-disclosure agreements are signed. On paper, this appears humane. Victims receive restitution. Public trials are avoided. But there is a darker consequence. When settlements replace trials, facts never enter the public record. Testimony is never cross-examined. Patterns remain hidden. Each case appears isolated, even when it is not. The system fragments the truth. Epstein's 2008 plea deal demonstrated this perfectly. By resolving the case privately and narrowly, it prevented broader scrutiny. It limited the scope of investigation. It insulated third parties, and it created a legal precedent that discouraged future challenges. That deal did more than reduce charges. It sent a message. If you are powerful enough, exposure can be negotiated. The files now coming to light suggest this model was repeated elsewhere. Different jurisdictions, different actors, same outcome, quiet resolution, minimal disruption, maximum protection for those at the top. One of the most chilling aspects of these documents is how often victims were discouraged from speaking. Not always through threats, but through exhaustion. Endless paperwork, repeated interviews, requests for proof that no victim should be expected to provide. The burden of truth was placed on those least equipped to carry it. Meanwhile, those with resources hired crisis managers, public relations firms, legal strategists. Their goal was not to prove innocence, but to manage perception.
to ensure that even if information surfaced, it would arrive fragmented, confusing, and easy to dismiss. Confusion is a powerful defense. When the public cannot easily understand a story, it disengages. Complexity becomes camouflage. This is why Epstein-like files matter so deeply. They are not designed to entertain. They are designed to clarify, to connect dots that were deliberately separated, to show that what looked like chaos was, in fact, structure. Consider the repeated appearance of private transportation in these cases. Flight records, charter logs, travel itineraries. These are not criminal by themselves, but patterns matter. When the same individuals appear repeatedly in proximity to known abuse locations, questions arise. Questions that were rarely asked, not because journalists failed, but because access was limited, legal risks were high, and editorial caution prevailed. The files also reveal how institutions protect themselves. Universities accepted donations without scrutiny, foundations welcomed funding without questions, events proceeded without oversight. When allegations surfaced, internal reviews were conducted quietly. Outcomes were rarely public. Institutional reputation was prioritized over transparency. This prioritization did not require malice. It required self-interest. No organization wants to admit it failed to protect. No board wants to acknowledge negligence. No administration wants its legacy defined by scandal. So the truth is softened. Language becomes vague. Responsibility is diffused. And time does the rest. As years passed after Epstein's death, many assumed the story had reached its limit. That assumption was premature. Because investigations do not always move forward in real time. Some move backward through archives, databases, and sealed records. The files now resurfacing are the result of persistence. Lawyers filing motions to unseal documents, journalists revisiting cold leads, survivors reasserting their voices, each action chipped away at the barrier. What these files reveal is not a singular conspiracy, but a shared vulnerability. Systems designed for efficiency are easily exploited by those who understand them. Legal frameworks meant to protect rights can be weaponized to prevent scrutiny. This is not corruption in the cinematic sense. It is procedural exploitation. One of the most striking patterns in Epstein-like cases is the absence of formal conclusions. Investigations end without closure. Reports are issued without findings. Recommendations are made without enforcement. The lack of resolution creates ambiguity. Ambiguity protects power. When no official determination exists, accountability becomes optional. Reputations remain intact, careers continue, and the system avoids reckoning. This is why the release of even partial files matters. Each document reduces ambiguity. Each record limits plausible deniability. Each name, even when redacted, suggests intentional concealment. Redaction is not neutral. When names are blacked out, the question is not only who is hidden, but why. Privacy is cited, legal risk is mentioned, but privacy has limits when public harm is involved. The files show that those limits were stretched repeatedly. Another overlooked element is how often investigations were divided across jurisdictions. Local police handled one aspect, federal agencies handled another, international authorities were involved elsewhere. Each operated within its mandate. Information sharing was limited, fragmentation became protection, no single agency saw the full picture, no unified narrative emerged, and without a narrative, the public could not demand accountability. This fragmentation was not necessarily intentional, but its effect was predictable. As more Epstein-like files emerge, they challenge the idea that justice fails randomly. They suggest that failure is patterned, that it follows incentives, that it aligns with power. The most unsettling realization is that exposure alone is not enough. Epstein was exposed. It did not dismantle the structure. It merely revealed its outline. What dismantles systems is sustained scrutiny, and scrutiny requires memory. The greatest ally of abuse is forgetfulness. When stories fade, systems reset. When names disappear from headlines, influence returns. When outrage cools, behavior continues. These files resist forgetfulness. They exist as records. They persist beyond news cycles. They wait for someone to connect them, and now, slowly, that connection is happening. Not because the system volunteered truth, but because truth refused to disappear. The coming parts of this story will examine what happens next. How public awareness changes incentives. How transparency alters risk. How accountability, even delayed, can still matter. Because history shows that systems built on silence eventually confront sound, and the sound is getting louder.